What if, tomorrow, every social media platform on Earth simply vanished? Hello and welcome. It's so good to have you here, in this quiet place we share. I've been thinking about the invisible architecture of our lives, the silent currents that pull us through our days. For billions of us, that architecture, that current, is the endless scroll. A constant river of information, connection, and noise that flows through these little glowing rectangles we hold in our hands. We wake up to it, we move through our day with it, we fall asleep to it. But what happens when the river runs dry? That's the experiment for today. A world without the feed. No Instagram, no TikTok, no X, no Facebook. Not a server crash, not a temporary outage, but a coordinated global ban. A permanent disconnection. The conversation about social media's effect on us is not new. We talk about mental health, polarization, and the very nature of truth in the digital age. Studies show that taking even short breaks can reduce stress and anxiety, but can also, paradoxically, increase loneliness. It's a technology that seems to embody the deepest contradictions of our time. It connects us across vast distances while potentially isolating us from the person sitting right across the table. It has fueled democratic movements and also deepened societal divisions. It's a tool, and like any tool, its impact is a reflection of our own intentions. But we are so far into the experiment now, so deeply integrated, that it's hard to imagine the alternative. The global creator economy alone was valued at over $189 billion in 2024. A vast ecosystem of individuals, marketers, and businesses built entirely on the foundations of these platforms. Millions of people, from small business owners to globally recognized influencers, depend on it not just for community, but for their livelihood. News now breaks on social media, spreading across the globe in moments, long before traditional outlets can even craft a headline. This is our baseline, our reality. A world humming with the constant, chaotic and vibrant energy of billions of voices speaking at once. Before we go deeper into this thought experiment, if you appreciate this space for curiosity, consider subscribing. And as we begin, I have a question for you. How would you spend your first day in a world without the scroll? What's the very first thing you would do? Tell me your thoughts below. I'd genuinely love to know, so let's imagine it. Day one of the Great Disconnection. It wouldn't begin with a bang, it would begin with silence, a strange, unfamiliar quiet in the pockets of our day. The morning commute on the train, where every face is normally illuminated by a soft blue light, would suddenly be filled with faces looking up at each other. Out the window, into the middle distance. The muscle memory would be the first ghost. The phantom limb of the thumb reaching for an icon that is no longer there. The habitual grab for the phone at the first hint of boredom, only to be met with a home screen that feels static, empty, finite. Research tells us the variable rewards of social media, the unpredictable surge of likes, comments, and shares, are what make it so addictive. On day one, that powerful psychological mechanism is severed. For some, the initial feeling might be panic, a gnawing anxiety, a neurobiological withdrawal from being perpetually connected, but for others, liberation. A sudden, unexpected gift of time. The American Psychological Association estimates that the kind of multitasking social media encourages can slash productivity by up to 40%. Suddenly, that time is returned. In its place, a profound lack of stimulus. No outrage of the hour, no algorithmically curated newsfeed, no endless stream of updates from friends and strangers. The silence was the first thing we noticed, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a machine that had suddenly and violently stopped. And in that silence, something else began to stir. That stirring was not a quiet awakening. It was the frantic, desperate scramble of a system in shock. On day 2, the silence curdled into confusion. Then the confusion gave way to a cold, sharp-edged panic. Think of the global financial markets. Companies like Meta, Snap, ByteDance. Their value wasn't just in their code, but in our attention. With the platforms gone, their market capitalizations evaporated in a single trading session, triggering a digital crash that bled into every sector of the economy. It was the first domino. The creator economy, that vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of millions of livelihoods, wasn't just wounded, it was annihilated overnight. The influencers, the small business owners using Instagram as their only storefront, the artists with global followings built over years, they woke up not just silenced, but unemployed. Their life's work, their digital archives, their entire professional existence, stored on servers that were now dark, was gone. A generation's worth of cultural and personal history deleted. A form of digital erasure so complete it was as if millions of voices had never been. But the economic tremor was only a symptom. The deeper crisis was one of information. We had, without truly realizing it, outsourced our global nervous system to these platforms. It was how we learned of elections, of protests, of natural disasters, of wars. Journalists on the ground in conflict zones used them to broadcast raw, unfiltered reality, a direct feed from the human experience. Activists used them to organize, to rally, to bypass state-controlled media, creating a powerful counter-narrative to institutional power. Now that nervous system was severed. The information void it left behind was terrifying, because a void does not stay empty for long. In its place, rumor became fact. Whispers became truth. The old channels, broadcast news, radio, print, were overwhelmed, too slow to verify, too centralized to capture the granular reality of a world in chaos. Without the democratized, real-time flow of information, power consolidated back into the hands of those who owned the remaining megaphones. And in the shadows of that consolidation, misinformation found fertile ground, not spreading at the speed of a retweet, but with the insidious, unstoppable power of word of mouth in a world starved for answers. I remember walking through my city on day 3. The phantom limb feeling was gone. In its place was a palpable tension. The ambient glow of screens had been replaced by a raw, naked awareness of each other. But it wasn't connection, it was suspicion. We looked at strangers not as potential followers, but as unknown quantities. Without the digital dossier of their curated lives, we were all just faces in a crowd, and the crowd felt anxious, agitated, volatile. Families were cut off, the son working in another country, whose only daily contact was a video call on a platform that no longer existed. The elderly parent whose only window to their grandchildren's lives was a shared photo album, now inaccessible. The relationships that had been sustained by the thin, digital thread of constant, low-stakes interaction began to fray and then to break. We discovered how many of our connections were not rooted in deep soil, but in the shallow, convenient substrate of the feed. Stripped of that, we were forced to confront the true state of our relationships, and for many, the reality was a profound and aching loneliness, a silence that felt less like peace and more like absence. The initial shock was about loss of business, loss of information, loss of connection. But by the end of the first week, it was transforming into something else. The focus was shifting from what we had lost to what was taking its place. The vacuum of power, of communication, of social structure was being filled. Governments, stripped of their primary tool for mass communication and, more importantly, mass surveillance, began to react with brute force. Some saw opportunity, a chance to reassert absolute control over the narrative, free from the prying eyes of citizen journalists. Others, especially those whose power was legitimized through online popular support, began to crumble. Their digital armies disbanded, their influence vanished. The entire architecture of modern social control had been built on these platforms. It was how they monitored dissent, shaped public opinion, and projected power. With that architecture gone, they were flying blind, and their first instinct was to build something new in its place. Something far more centralized, far more opaque. The quiet liberation some had felt on day one now seemed like a naive dream. We had mistaken the silence of the cage for the quiet of freedom. The bars had simply become invisible, and what was coming to replace them would be built not of light and code, but of something far older and far more solid. The first emergency broadcasts began on day 7, beamed across every television and radio frequency. They weren't about restoring what we'd lost, they were about building what came next. And we were about to learn that the opposite of algorithmic control wasn't freedom. It was something else entirely. It began not with a broadcast, but with a brand. The Meridian system. It sounded clean, stable, unifying. A new digital infrastructure for a new world. This was the answer promised by the emergency broadcasts. The state-run platforms that rolled out were elegant in their simplicity, brutal in their control. Your access was tied to your digital citizenship ID. There was a portal for news, vetted, singular, national, a service for essential communications, monitored, text-based, no file sharing, and a utility for public services. The internet had been reframed not as a web of connection, but as a municipal utility like water or electricity. It flowed in one direction, from them to us. My internet was no longer a window onto the world. It was a state-issued newsletter delivered to a screen. The chaos of a billion voices had been replaced by the chilling clarity of one. The real transformation, however, was happening on the streets. Without the global square to gather in, we retreated into the village. Our world, which had once felt limitlessly vast, had shrunk to the size of our postcode. At first, there was a strange nostalgic novelty to it. We learned the names of our neighbors, the rhythms of the local shops. We were forced into a kind of radical locality. But this was not a gentle return to community. It was a regression into tribalism. Without the context of a wider world, our hyperlocal realities became our only reality. Rumors that once would have been debunked in seconds by a quick search could now fester for weeks, hardening into local dogma. Suspicion of outsiders became rampant, a different accent, an unfamiliar face. These were now sources of immediate distrust. We were rebuilding society from the ground up, but we were using fear and ignorance as our primary materials. Our social circles became echo chambers not of algorithm, but of proximity. And in these tiny, sealed-off worlds, social pressure became a suffocating force. There was nowhere to hide, no digital alias to retreat behind. Your identity was singular, physical, and constantly under the scrutiny of the people you saw every single day. The weight of being constantly, irreducibly seen was immense. What I came to call the Great Forgetting was the most insidious change. A decade of global culture created and stored on the vanished platforms was now gone. The art, the music, the political movements, the shared jokes, the language itself. It was all evaporating from our collective memory. We would try to describe a meme, a viral video, a shared cultural moment, but the words would fail us. It was like trying to describe a color to someone who has never seen it. We had no archive. An entire generation's cultural footprint had been wiped clean, leaving us with a phantom ache for a culture that no longer had a name. We became untethered from our recent past, a generation with a digitally induced amnesia. In its place, the state-sponsored culture fed to us through Meridian felt sterile, hollow. It was art with no argument, music with no soul, news with no dissent. It was the sound of a world holding its breath. But the human need for genuine connection, for a voice, does not simply disappear. It goes underground. And so began the age of the new samizdat. It started small. Whispers of USB drives passed hand to hand, containing banned books, foreign films, uncensored articles. Someone would get their hands on a shortwave radio, and a dozen people would huddle in a basement, listening to static-filled broadcasts from halfway around the world, a ghost of the global conversation we had lost. These were whispers of defiance in the great, imposed silence. The artists, the thinkers, the programmers who had been silenced were not idle. They were looking for the cracks in the meridian system, exploiting old physical infrastructure, building shadow networks that were slow, fragile, and dangerous to access. They called them ghost nets, fleeting temporary islands of connection in the vast state-controlled ocean. To be caught accessing one was not just a crime, it was an act of treason. The choice, for most, was simple. Accept the sterile safety of Meridian. It was predictable, it was quiet, and it kept you out of trouble. But the silence had begun to feel more like a scream to me. And then, one afternoon, tucked inside a second-hand book I bought from a market stall, I found it. Not a USB drive, not a note, just a small, intricate drawing of a moth stamped on the corner of a blank page. I had heard whispers of this symbol. It was not a message, it was an invitation, an address to a place where a ghost net was said to be active. I held the book, the thin paper feeling heavy in my hand, the weight of a choice. They had taken our platforms to stop us from talking. What they didn't realize is that they had given us something far more dangerous to talk about, a world without them. The question was no longer about how to live in their silence. It was about whether to risk everything for a single, illicit echo of what we had lost. That moth, a simple smudge of ink on a page, became the only thing in my world that felt real. The curated news from Meridian, the forced pleasantries with neighbors who were now also my potential watchers, the suffocating quiet of the city, it was all a stage play. The moth was a tear in the backdrop. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was an awakening. The risk was not in going, the risk was in staying, in allowing my mind to atrophy within the sterile confines of the state's narrative, to forget what it felt like to have a thought that wasn't, in some way, approved. So I went. The address led me to a part of the city I hadn't visited in years, a district of silent warehouses and skeletal factories, relics of an older economy. Every step felt amplified, every shadow seemed to move. The fear was physical, a cold knot in my stomach. This was the new reality. Dissent was no longer a matter of typing an anonymous comment. It was a physical act, a journey into a forbidden geography. It required you to move your body through a space that was hostile to your intent. Meridian's surveillance wasn't just online, it was in the cameras that watched every street corner, the citizenship checkpoints that could spring up without warning. I was a ghost, trying to move through a machine designed to see everything. I found the building. It was a derelict library, its windows boarded up, its great stone entrance sealed. The invitation had instructed me to wait by a side door, a simple steel slab covered in rust and faded graffiti. And in the waiting, I felt the true weight of what I was doing. If a door opened, I would step through, and I would never be able to go back to the oblivious safety of my old life. If it didn't, I would have to walk back through the hostile city, marked by my journey, forever looking over my shoulder. The silence stretched, then a faint click. The door opened a fraction and a hand beckoned me in. The space inside was cold, smelling of damp paper and ozone. I was led down into the archives, into a sub-basement where the air was thick and still. And there I saw it. The ghost net. It wasn't a sleek server room. It was a chaotic web of salvaged parts, a Frankenstein's monster of old laptops, repurposed routers, and tangled cables, all powered by a humming jury-rig generator. This was the heart of the resistance, a fragile, flickering pulse of pure data. I was handed a terminal, a relic from a bygone era, and a set of simple, text-based instructions. When I finally connected, there was no sound, no flash of images, just a single line of green text appearing on a black screen. "Welcome, Ghost. You are not alone." And I wept. The raw, unfiltered emotion of it was overwhelming. The screen filled with text. It was a torrent, a chaotic flood of conversation from other nodes across the city, across the country. People sharing fragments of poems, lines of code, schematics for shortwave radios. They shared news, real news, pieced together from whispers and illicit radio intercepts. A strike at a factory in the north, a food shortage in a town to the east. A list of people who had been disappeared by the state. This wasn't the performative connection of the old platforms. This was the desperate, essential connection of a hive mind trying to survive. There were no profiles, no likes, no followers. There were only voices stripped of everything but their content. It was the internet in its purest form, a conversation, a dangerous, beautiful, illegal conversation. I learned that the people running this node were the former librarians of this very building. They had become archivists of the present, curators of dissent. But this fragile sanctuary was an island in a sea of predators. We learned of the signal hunters, specialized state security units whose only job was to triangulate the source of ghost net transmissions. They were the new inquisitors. The stories on the net were terrifying. A node in another city had gone silent mid-sentence. We all knew what it meant. The operators were gone. The users were compromised. The fear was a constant, humming undercurrent to every word we typed. Every connection was a gamble. Every message was a potential death sentence. The moth symbol wasn't just an invitation, it was a mark. And Meridian was learning how to hunt the moths. One night, a message appeared on the screen, addressed directly to the public channel, a broadcast to all the ghosts logged in at that moment. It wasn't a story or a poem, it was a plan. A coordinated, system-wide action. The message spoke of a day of noise, a single moment where every ghostnet across the globe would attempt to bridge their connections and momentarily pierce the Meridian firewall, broadcasting a single, unified message of defiance to the public. It was insane, a suicide mission. It would expose the entire network, but it was also a spark, a chance to remind the silent world that another reality was still possible. At the bottom of the message was a request. They needed runners, not digital, but physical. They needed people to carry encryption keys on foot from one node to the next to synchronize the network for the broadcast. It was the only way to do it without leaving a digital trail the hunters could trace. My terminal flickered and a private message appeared, a single line from the librarians who ran my node. "We need to get a key to a node across the river. We think you can do it." The moth on the page had invited me to listen. The text on the screen was now asking me to act. And in the silence of that cold, damp basement, I understood that my life as a ghost was over. I now had to become a courier carrying a single, fragile word through a world that would kill me for it. And that word was freedom. The key wasn't a piece of metal. It was a microdrive, no bigger than my fingernail, sealed in a dull, grey ceramic shell. To an X-ray, it would look like a button. To a casual inspection, a worthless piece of debris, but it held a string of characters that could, for a few seconds, unlock the world. Holding it, I felt its impossible weight. This was the first time the digital resistance had become truly physical for me. I was no longer just typing words into a void, I was a component in the machine, a biological transport layer for a single, critical data packet. The librarians gave me my route, a winding, illogical path through the city's forgotten arteries, designed to avoid checkpoints and surveillance hubs. They gave me a new coat, a new identity card, a low-level sanitation worker, and a look that said goodbye and thank you, and I'm sorry. To move through the city was to move through the mind of the state. I could feel its gaze on me, the cold, indifferent logic of the cameras perched on every corner. Every pedestrian I passed was a potential informant. Every police drone that hummed overhead was a potential executioner. The silence of the streets was no longer passive, it was predatory. My own heartbeat became a frantic drum against the cage of my ribs, a rhythm of pure animal terror. My task was to cross the river to the industrial sector and find a specific bench in a small, disused park. There, at a precise time, I was to leave a copy of a specific newspaper with the key tucked inside its folded pages. I wouldn't know who picked it up. The protocol was absolute. No contact, no recognition, no words. Trust had been decentralized, just like our network. It existed in the adherence to the plan, a shared faith in the action of strangers. I saw them twice. The signal hunters. They didn't look like soldiers. They moved in unmarked vans, wearing the plain grey uniforms of Meridian technicians. But they carried scanners, and their eyes were not the eyes of maintenance workers. They were predators, sniffing the air for the scent of rogue data. I pressed myself into a doorway as one of their vans crawled past, my blood turning to ice. I was carrying the very thing they were born to find. I felt like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The park was deserted, a patch of dying grass and broken benches, an appendix of the city that had been forgotten. I sat on the designated bench, my hands trembling as I folded the newspaper, placing the small ceramic lump into its crease. I left it there and walked away without looking back, every nerve screaming. The walk back was worse. The key was gone, the package delivered, but I felt marked, exposed. I was no longer just a ghost, I was an accomplice. When I returned to the library, the atmosphere in the basement had changed. The usual quiet hum of activity was gone, replaced by a dense, electric stillness. Every operator was at their terminal, their faces illuminated by the green glow of the screen. We were all connected, a silent, invisible congregation waiting for the signal. And then it began. A countdown appeared on every screen in the network, synchronized across every node in the world that was still alive. 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, a decade of silence, of suppressed thought, of forced conformity seemed to coalesce into a single point of unbearable pressure. 5 minutes. The librarians began methodically destroying their equipment, smashing hard drives, pouring acid on circuit boards. There was no going back. This was the last broadcast. 1 minute. I looked at the faces around me, strangers who had become my only community. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. We just watched the numbers fall. 0. For a single, breathtaking second, nothing happened. And then the GhostNet erupted. The text on our screens was replaced by a single, powerful symbol, a moth, its wings spread wide. And we knew that across the world, on every Meridian device, on every public screen, on every television still connected to the state network, this symbol had appeared. And with it, a sound. not a voice, not a piece of music. It was the sound of a human heartbeat, steady and strong, and then a single line of text in 1,000 different languages. Did you think we were gone? The broadcast lasted for 9 seconds. 9 seconds of a unified global act of digital defiance. Then the screens went black. A moment later, we heard it. The scream of sirens outside, growing closer. The heavy thud of boots on the stairs above. The signal hunters had us. The node was compromised. It was over. We scattered through the library's ancient secret passageways, following escape routes planned long ago. I ran, my lungs burning. The image of the moth burned into my mind. I didn't know who had made it out. I didn't know if the librarians were safe. I didn't know anything except that I could not stop running. I am still running. A ghost once more, but a different kind. I no longer have a network, a terminal, a community. But I have the memory of those 9 seconds. They didn't topple the government, they didn't destroy Meridian, but they did something more important. They punctured the silence. They planted a question in the minds of millions. Did you think we were gone? And in that question lies the entire human story. We had been stripped of our global stage, our billion-voiced choir, but we had learned to sing in the dark. And that is a song you can never truly silence. Running. That is all there was. The city itself had become the machine, and I was a foreign body it was trying to expel. After the day of noise, the sirens were not a temporary alarm. They became the new ambient sound, the city's unceasing heartbeat. Meridian's response was not a series of arrests. It was a surgical purge they called the Reckoning. Loudspeakers, mounted on the same posts as the cameras, now broadcast names. Names of the captured, names of the suspected. My name was not among them, but every name they read felt like a hammer blow, a warning that the anonymity of the ghost was a luxury that had expired. The city I had known, with its quiet, suffocating obedience, was gone. In its place was a landscape of naked, systematic fear. The moth, our beautiful symbol of defiance, was turned against us. Meridian co-opted it. They painted it on the doors of the accused. It became a mark of shame, a modern-day yellow star. To see a moth painted on a neighbor's door was to witness a social execution. They were now the infected, and any association with them meant you too were contaminated. The 9 seconds of hope had been masterfully twisted into a permanent instrument of terror. We had tried to awaken the public, but instead we had given the state the very monster it needed to justify its final, absolute grip on our lives. We had shown them the face of their enemy, and now they were hunting it with a zeal that bordered on religious. My life as a courier was over. I was now something less. A scavenger. I lived in the city's veins, the storm drains and forgotten subway tunnels, surviving on what I could find, what was thrown away. My identity was a ghost story I told only to myself, a reminder that I was once a person with a home, a name, a life before the running. The physical hardship was immense, but the psychological erosion was the true enemy. Weeks bled into months, and the memory of the ghost net, of that brief electric community, began to feel like a dream. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold companion in the dark. I was a single, disconnected node, and I knew that a node, alone, eventually dies. The silence I had once railed against was now my only shield, my camouflage. One rainy night, huddled under a rusted bridge, I saw something that stopped my breath. On the concrete pillar opposite me, almost invisible in the gloom, was a fresh chalk mark. It wasn't a moth. It was a new symbol, something I had never seen before, a simple circle with a single broken line through the center, an incomplete circuit. It was a language born of total desperation. I had no idea what it meant. It could be a trap, a new method used by the hunters to lure out the last of us. For 3 days, I watched that mark, fighting the war between hope and paranoia. On the third night, a second mark appeared beside it, a series of 5 vertical lines, a number, a location. It was a choice, again. But this time it felt different. It was not an invitation to a digital space. It felt like a summons, a call to arms in a war we had already lost. I followed the clue. It led me to a series of other marks, a scavenger hunt through the city's underbelly, a conversation conducted in chalk. Each symbol was a breadcrumb pulling me deeper into a new, terrifyingly analog network. This was the Resistance, reborn. Slower, more primitive, infinitely more dangerous. There were no screens, no data packets. The network was now made of people. We were the data, passed from one to another through whispers, symbols, and dead drops. The final mark led me to a decommissioned water filtration plant. And there, I found them. Not librarians or hackers, but a handful of other runners, survivors of the reckoning. Their faces were thin, their eyes held the same hunted look as my own. Our leader was a woman I had only ever known on the GhostNet by her handle, Cassandra. She was a systems architect, one of the original coders who had built the GhostNet. She looked older than her digital ghost had ever seemed. She told us what they had learned in those 9 seconds. The broadcast wasn't just a message, it was a diagnostic. In piercing Meridian's firewall, they had forced the system to reveal its core architecture. They had found its heart, not a server farm or a data center, but a physical location, a single subterranean hub through which all of Meridian's control signals flowed, a master switch. The reckoning, the purge, the public fear, it was all a frantic effort to distract from the fact that for 9 seconds we had seen the system's soul and we had discovered it was mortal. The new plan was not to broadcast, it was not to inform or inspire, it was to sever, a physical strike, a targeted demolition, to destroy the hub and plunge the entire state apparatus into chaos. It was not a suicide mission, it was a martyrdom mission. No one who went would be coming back. Cassandra looked at each of us, her gaze unflinching. "They have made us into ghosts," she said, her voice a low whisper in the echoing chamber. "It is time we showed them what a ghost can do." The question was no longer about freedom. It was about whether we were willing to become the weapon that would win it for others, at the cost of our own obliteration. There was no training, no rousing speeches. There was only the cold, quiet work of planning and ending. Our cell of ghosts became a single organism, each of us a vital limb, moving with a shared, unspoken purpose. We were past fear. Fear is a luxury for those with a future. We were cartographers of our own oblivion, and in that we found a strange monastic calm. We learned the schematics of the Meridian Hub, memorizing its ventilation shafts, its power conduits, its security patrol schedules, until the building became a map etched onto the inside of our skulls. My role was simple. I was the key. Not a carrier this time, but the one who would physically initiate the overload sequence. My body, my hands, my presence were the final lines of code in this program of destruction. The hub was not hidden. It was a monument, a vast, windowless cube of black concrete that occupied an entire city block, a brutalist testament to the singularity of the state's power. It was designed to be impenetrable. But Cassandra, our Cassandra, had found its flaw. A single, unmonitored maintenance duct, a relic from the building's original construction that led directly into the cooling system for the core processors. It was a flaw born of arrogance, an assumption that no one would ever be mad enough to try. We were that mad. We went in under the cover of a storm. The the kind of torrential downpour that blinded cameras and muffled sound. We moved through the city's flooded sewers, the filth and the cold, a final baptism before our descent. Entering the maintenance duct was like being swallowed. The air changed instantly, from the organic rot of the sewer to a sterile, refrigerated hum. The air tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing. It was the sanitized atmosphere of a machine's tomb. We moved in single file through the tight metal intestines of the building, the only sound our own ragged breathing and the low, omnipresent thrum of the hub's core. It was the sound of the world's brain thinking its one approved thought. With every meter we pressed forward, the weight of what we were about to do grew heavier. This wasn't a broadcast to awaken minds. This was a physical blow to the head. The destruction of this place would not be clean. It would trigger a systemic cascade, a shutdown of power grids, communication networks, water supplies. We were not just killing a system, we were creating a wound that would fester for years. We were trading a quiet tyranny for a loud, bloody chaos. We had told ourselves this was a necessary sacrifice, but in the cold, humming darkness of that duct, the word necessary felt thin, inadequate. We were about to hurt millions of innocent people to free them. The morality of it was a knot that could no longer be untied. We had to simply cut it. We reached the access point to the primary cooling chamber. This was Cassandra's part. She worked on the electronic lock, her face a mask of concentration, her fingers dancing over a custom-built decryption device. For 3 minutes, that stretched into an eternity, the only sound was the faint clicking of her tool. Then a green light. The heavy steel door hissed open. Before us was the heart of Meridian. It was a cavernous, cathedral-like space, filled with rows upon rows of silently processing server racks. The air was frigid, and the low hum was now a deep, resonant bass note that vibrated through the floor, through my bones. This was the source of the silence, and that's when we saw him. A single technician doing a late-night diagnostic. He wasn't a signal hunter, he wasn't a soldier, he was just a man holding a tablet, humming softly to himself, completely oblivious. Our plan had accounted for guards, for patrols, for automated defenses. It had not accounted for a man humming in the dark. Our phantom raid had suddenly collided with a mundane, human reality. He looked up, his eyes widening not with alarm, but with simple, dumbfounded surprise. In that moment, he was not the system. He was not Meridian. He was just a person, in the wrong place at the catastrophic moment we arrived. One of our group moved forward, a silenced weapon in his hand. The technician just stared, paralyzed, and I knew this was the final moral event horizon. We had justified the abstract collateral damage to millions, but this was one man looking at us, and his death was the price of entry to our grand, violent gesture. We were no longer ghosts. We had become monsters. He didn't scream. He didn't even gasp. There was no sound, just a soft, final exhalation, like a sigh. The ghost beside me lowered his weapon. The technician crumpled to the floor, his tablet clattering beside him, its screen still glowing with meaningless diagnostics. The humming man was gone. In his place was a problem that had been solved. We stepped over the body as if it were a loose cable on the floor, our humanity a casualty we had to discard to complete the mission. The knot of morality had been cut, and the blade was cold and sharp. I felt nothing. That was the most terrifying part. A great, hollow void where my horror should have been. The monster had finished its work. Cassandra was already at the main console, her fingers flying across a terminal, bypassing the final security protocols. The rest of us moved with a terrifying efficiency, planting the shaped charges on the primary power conduits, each of us a silent gear in this well-oiled machine of destruction. I moved toward the core processor's manual override panel. This was my station, my purpose. I held a small device, the final key designed by Cassandra to trigger a recursive feedback loop in the cooling system. It would not cause an explosion of fire, but of ice, a flash freeze that would shatter the crystalline processors, followed by a power surge that would cascade backward through every network on the planet, frying them from the inside out. It was an electronic nerve agent, a silent, digital poison. I looked at Cassandra. She gave me a single, sharp nod. The order. This was it. The culmination of the running, the hiding, the whispers in the dark. I slid the key into its port. The system screen in front of me shifted, a new line of code blinking, awaiting my command. I typed the final sequence. And as a final, bitter tribute to the spark that started this fire, I programmed a 9-second delay. 9 seconds of hope had led to this. 9 seconds of destruction would be its echo. I entered the command. A single, soft chime echoed through the cathedral of servers. A countdown timer appeared on the screen. 9. We ran. 8. The humming of the servers began to change, the pitch rising into a frantic, keening shriek. 7. The lights flickered, casting strobe-like shadows that danced like frantic ghosts around the body on the floor. 6. We scrambled back into the maintenance duct, the steel door hissing shut behind us, sealing the tomb. 5. The metal beneath my hands began to vibrate violently. 4. A deep, groaning sound came from the core, the sound of something unimaginably vast and complex breaking apart. 3. The air in the duct grew instantly, painfully cold, flash frost blooming on the walls around us. 2. I could hear the pop and crackle of a billion circuits shorting out, a sound like a forest fire made of lightning. 1. Then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was deeper and more terrifying than anything Meridian had ever imposed. The hum was gone. The world's brain was dead. We crawled back through the tunnels, back through the sewers, our movements frantic, desperate. We emerged into the storm, back into the city, and it was a different world. It was not the world we had set out to free. The power was out. The entire city was plunged into a primal darkness, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning. The silence lasted only a moment. It was replaced by a new sound. At first, a few confused shouts, then car alarms, their internal batteries kicking in, then screams, not of terror, but of rage, of confusion, and then breaking glass. We had not cut the power, we had cut the cord of control. And the city, a beast held on a leash for years, was suddenly violently free. We had thought we were delivering a shock to the system, but we hadn't. We had killed the system. We had killed the lights, the water, the transport, the logistics that fed the city. We hadn't started a revolution. We had started a collapse. I stood in the rain, watching the silhouettes of people tearing apart their own world, and the hollow place inside me finally filled with something. It wasn't guilt, it was understanding. We had set out to destroy a monster, and in its place, we had unleashed 10 million smaller ones. The problem wasn't the cage, it was us. And we had just broken the door, leaving us all trapped in the dark, with the animal that had been staring back at us all along. The 9 seconds of silence that followed the hub's death was the last moment of peace on Earth. We had imagined a reset, a return to something purer. What we got was the Stone Age delivered at the speed of light. The first days were a riot of pure, undirected energy, a city-wide spasm of a nervous system that had been severed from its brain. But the riots burned themselves out, replaced by a more patient and far more terrifying predator: thirst, then hunger, then disease. Without Meridian, there was no water purification, no food distribution, no sanitation. The city, our great human achievement, was actively trying to kill us, decomposing around us like a colossal corpse. I survived those first weeks by becoming less than a ghost. I became a rat. I learned the cartography of filth, the secret pathways of decay. My world was one of rust and rot, and the quiet, desperate scrabbling of other rats, both animal and human. The grand philosophical questions that had driven us, freedom, control, information, they were meaningless luxuries now. The only question was, is this water clean enough to drink? Is this food too rotten to eat? Can I make it to morning? We had torn down the prison walls and discovered, to our horror, that the walls had been holding up the roof. The new social structures grew like mold on a corpse. Power didn't return to the people. It atomized. It fell into the hands of anyone strong enough to take it and brutal enough to hold it. Neighborhoods became micro-states, ruled by warlords who controlled a well, a generator, a stockpile of canned food. They were the new kings, their thrones built of scrap metal and fear. I saw one of them execute a man for stealing a loaf of bread. The king did it himself with a piece of rebar in front of a silent, watching crowd. No one intervened. This wasn't the cold, procedural violence of the state. This was personal. It was intimate. And it was infinitely worse. Meridian had controlled our minds. These new kings controlled our bodies, our next breath. I had to know what happened to the others, to my cell, to Cassandra. Were they now kings in this new world of ruin? Or were they, like me, rats in the walls? My search was a pilgrimage through hell. I learned to read the new signs, the gang tags that marked territory, the specific ways a body was left in the street to send a message. I learned to trade, not with money, but with information, with whispers, with the last vestiges of my former life. I traded a working knowledge of water pipe schematics for a handful of antibiotics. I traded the location of a forgotten government food cache for safe passage across a bridge. My memories, my skills, the very things that made me part of the resistance were now just currency in the barter economy of collapse. I finally found him in a place they called the clinic, a former school gymnasium where the sick and the dying were brought to be tended by a skeleton crew of doctors who still remembered their oath. He was one of ours, one of the ghosts who had been in the hub with me. I barely recognized him. He was broken, his leg shattered, his body ravaged by infection. He told me what happened. We had scattered, but we didn't all escape. Some were caught in the chaos, torn apart by the very crowds we had meant to liberate. Others, the more pragmatic ones, had seen the coming tide and seized power. They had become the new kings, using their knowledge of the old systems to dominate the new world. They were worse than the brutes because they knew exactly what they were doing. And Cassandra? He looked at me, his eyes clouded with fever and something that looked like shame. She saw it, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She saw what we had done, what we were becoming. She said we hadn't destroyed the machine, we had just unleashed the code, that the system wasn't in the hub, it was inside of us. He told me she had left, gone toward the city center, toward the black, silent monument of the dead Meridian hub. She had been talking about building something new, not a resistance, an antidote. She believed the only way to stop the virus we had unleashed was to create a new one, a new form of control born from the ashes of the old. She went to the dead heart of the old world to create the seed of the next. The search for my mentor, my leader, was over. I now had a new mission. I had to hunt her down. We had destroyed the world to free it from a single, centralized form of control. Now, the architect of that destruction was going to build another, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my soul that whatever she built now in this broken world with her broken heart would be 1,000 times more monstrous than Meridian had ever been.